the accident at TMI was very highly publicized. People knew, in the area knew about it, physicians knew about it, and so they recognized that as a problem. If they compared 3 Mile Island to an unexposed population somewhere else, there would be no way to avoid this potential bias. So what they did was, they identified one study area, which is about a 10-mile radius, which at the time had about 160,000 people. And they decided to do the study only within this population. So now they have to say, well, what are the exposed and unexposed groups?
Give me a minute here.
So they knew this would be a cancer incidence study, so they went to 19 local and 5 referral hospitals to get information on cancer diagnoses for the period 1975 to 1985. And then they divided this 10-mile area up into 69 small tracts based on the boundaries used by the U.S. Census Bureau so that they would know how many people lived there. And then they used the limited monitoring data and release estimates to create a dispersion model to estimate where the radioactive plumes went. So what it means is that the exposed and the unexposed groups that are being compared are all within the 10-mile area, all exposed to the same news stories about 3 Mile Island, the same potential for their physicians to order extra tests and so on, to avoid this potential for a bias. So the other thing that's very important to know is that the dosimetrists, the people estimating the doses to the local population, felt that there was too little information to know exactly what the doses were. They just felt they could not say whether it was 1 or 10 or 100 because of the limited information about the releases. So what they did was, rather than give a unit, and Arnie Gunderson talked about R, rather than giving a unit of rads or rem, or in international units, gray or Sievert, they simply ordered the 69 tracts from the lowest to the highest in such a way that if a tract had 100, a value of 100, their estimate was that that's 10 times more radiation dose than a tract with 10. Or if you had 200, that was twice as much as 100. So they wanted to get everything on a relative scale. They also had information on other characteristics of the local population that they used. Now, they reported these results in the American Journal of Epidemiology in 1990, and they concluded that there was no evidence that gamma radiation doses from the accident had led to any increase in cancer. And this was, so it was in the early 1990s that I was asked to review this study and check the calculations. And at first I told the Amets and others that I thought this study was done, and I believe it was done by a very well-qualified group of epidemiologists, and I didn't have any reason to question their work. And I do think the study was very well designed. And let me mention one other thing. Note here that they begin their assembly of cancer records before the accident occurred. And so this becomes really the most unusual aspect of the design of the study. It's because cancer varies everywhere, regardless of whether they're nuclear plants, for lots of reasons. Smoking, diet, and so on. Occupational exposures. And variations in background radiation. All could lead to variations in cancer rates. So by collecting information before the accident, having some years of data before the accident, it means we know what the geographic pattern was before this occurred. Because it would be unfair to assign excess cancers to an area downwind of the plumes if that area already had high cancer rates before the accident. And that's something that, because of the design of the study, because they thought to get the cancer records from the prior years, it's something that we could do in our statistical analysis. I would note that in the tabular results that they present in their paper, they don't do that. We also noted several other problems with their work. They concentrated on mostly on rare cancers, such as childhood cancers, because it's true that children or the fetus are more sensitive to radiation than adults. But there's so few cases that it gives little basis for an epidemiologic analysis that depends on having adequate numbers. They also were unable to follow birth cohorts. It's another problem. I won't go into the details of that one. They also had some problems, simple data management problems with counting of cases. And also, there were incomplete records for 1975 from the hospitals. So they had an undercount of the cases before the accident because we thought that we should be looking at these pre-accident data. We didn't want to have an upward bias saying, well, because 1975 is low, it would make it look like the post-accident rates were much higher. So we took out 1975 and redefined the pre-accident period as 1976 through March 1979, based on the idea that we didn't want that undercount to bias our analysis. So let me share with you now our findings. They're summarized in this map. Here's the 3 Mile Islands, Susquehanna River, Harrisburg, up here. So these are the estimates from the dosimetrists under the funding with the court order that I showed previously of where the plumes went. And the heaviest plumes are in the darkest red to the northwest. And then there's some to the northeast and a little bit to the southeast. But there are other areas that are very, very low. And the numbers, you may not be able to see this in the back, but this green is 0. And the very darkest red goes up some of those tracts. The highest tract is relative to 0, 1,666 units. So there's quite a range according to the scale that they use. And the colors here are tied not only to the estimated doses of radiation, but in the bars to the lung cancer rates for the time period 1981 through 1985. And the lung cancer rates in this take account of the pre-accident rates. So we're adjusting out whatever the pattern was before the accident and saying, what's the additional amount after the accident? This line across the middle of the bars says this is the average for the whole 10-mile area after the accident. And you can see that in the green areas with the lowest estimates of the radiation dose, the cancer rates were a half to maybe 80% of the average for the 10-mile area. Whereas at the highest dose level, the cancer rates were over twice the average for the 10-mile area. And that at each radiation dose category, from 0 to the highest, there's an increase, what we would call a linear dose-response relationship. So the ordering of the cancer rates after the accident corresponds directly with the estimates of the magnitude of the dose. Now, what could produce this? It's adjusted for the pre-accident cancer incidence rates. How could we explain this? Well, if you believe that the official estimate of the maximum dose of 100 milligram, less than annual background, is the true, and we know that with certainty, then we could come up with some other explanations. So for example, and we thought about this quite a bit. We said, well, suppose people who smoked cigarettes more before the accident lived in these areas here with low doses during the accident, and they moved after the accident. So when they got their lung cancers, they had moved to these areas. And people here who didn't smoke moved from these areas to these other areas. So that kind of pattern is theoretically possible. But we don't really think that's plausible, that smokers and non-smokers moved from areas, because nobody, of course, knew where these plumes were anyway. Even if smokers did have some, and if people did have some reason to move according to their smoking status. So I believe this is very good evidence that goes along with Arnie Gunderson's suggestion that the releases were potentially 1,000 times greater than what has been the story we've been told. It goes along with the idea that the symptoms reported by people in the area and the animal deaths were not due to stress, but were due to exposure to radiation, and not just to gamma radiation, but potentially to beta and alpha radiation. And for me, the message for us today is, as we think about the current plans to expand nuclear power in this country and to promote nuclear reactors, whatever you think about the problems of waste storage or waste transportation or nuclear proliferation or other things, that when we hear, which we do hear often, that no one was harmed at 3 Mile Island, that this really should cause us to question that. And I would encourage any of you who are interested to really go back and look, as Arnie Gunderson did, into the records, to talk with people who have been here, and to resurrect some of this history, because I think it's really relevant to the debates that we're having today.